All right, welcome to The Mind of a Theist, episode 5. I'm here with Dan today, and essentially we'll just be going through those familiar questions that I've been asking. And yeah, we'll just see how it goes and where it sort of leads us. So, can you just tell us a bit about yourself? How would you define yourself denominationally? Where would you sit camp-wise for the Christians?
Yeah, man. Well, it's good to be here. So I've been born and raised in a Baptist church. I myself theologically am Reformed, which I'm more than happy to go on to explain at some point. But I would certainly class myself as a Reformed Baptist.
Okay, excellent. It's good. We're going for a Pokemon approach where we're trying to get one of each.
That's the one.
Yeah. So basically, to sort of set the stage and sort of have our sort of listeners understand what they're in for in a way. I just have a couple terms that we're just going to define. So
Yep.
the first is, what is science to you?
Science is obviously it's a vast array of different disciplines, different fields. Science is, in and of itself is perhaps best defined as the study of the physical universe in which we find ourselves. Again, covering those vast arrays of different fields such as biology, whether it be chemistry, astrophysics, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you said vast array because there's nothing worse than those Facebook pages of I love science and it's like
Yeah, which one?
yeah, exactly. Define which one. So the next one is, what is evolution?
What is evolution? I think that there's a common misunderstanding in regard to evolution as it purely being a biological process.
Yep, that's
Evolution, in its full commensurate definition, is extending all the way back based on the evolutionary model to the Big Bang.
That's right.
There are 6 different forms of evolution, ranging from cosmic to stellar evolution, all the way through to then once you come to biology specifically, you've really got macroevolution, the process of different genus morphing into different genus over time, and then you've got microevolution or adaptation.
Adaptation, yes.
Changes within particular species, such as Darwin's finches or whatnot.
Yes, and that's that. I'm glad you understand that. A lot of people sort of solely base their sort of I wouldn't say presupposition, but they solely focus on the microevolution aspect of the entire theorem.
Yeah.
So how old is the Earth? And what I mean by this is, do you take Genesis as a literal account, or is it more of an allegorical account?
Yes, I do take Genesis to be a literal account, whilst understanding properly the literary genre and makeup of particularly Genesis 1 and 2, which is obviously the areas of scripture in question.
Of course.
Yes. I am a one of them 6-day creationists.
Excellent.
But no, I am 6 little days, 24-hour. God did it, and God did what He said He did. And yes, the Earth is young. Do I hold dogmatically to a 6,004 years?
Yes, yeah.
No, 6 to 8,000 years. I'm not particularly fussed on an exact date, but when I say 6 to 8,000 years, I don't mean 4.5 billion.
Okay, no, that's excellent. And you know, we're trying to get as many sort of diverse opinions on these matters as we can, so that's great. So the next question is to define God, but I'll give some context to this. So, can you define God to somebody? Let's say there was an adult who came from a secular or atheistic society that had no sort of spiritual characteristics. That's obviously a hypothetical, but how would you explain God to them in terms of, well, your understanding, but also how would you explain the very concept of God, really?
The very concept of God. God is it would be easy to say God is a spiritual being, but then I would have to labour to describe what spiritual
is, yeah.
But God is certainly an entity or a being who exists outside of time and space. He's the creator of all things, the creator of space, time, and matter, everything in which we find ourselves. He created us and He fashioned us from the womb of our mother. He created the universe ex nihilo, out of nothing. And then I would go on to describe his character and attributes. So the fact that he is completely holy, completely just, and righteous. He is altogether loving and merciful and kind, and so on and so forth.
Okay, no, excellent.
I'd also then go into, once I've sort of gone through that, to explain the fact that God is triune, the fact that he is one being shared by three persons who are co-equal and co-eternal, which we can go on to define.
Yeah, fair enough. No worries. So does this concept to you align with Yahweh or the Abrahamic God? So obviously in the Bible we have things like Moses actually seeing God, and we have them interacting. We have the things like the covenant and the Ark of the Covenant, and others where he exists within a fixed point. So even with Jesus and whatnot, does this sort of align with the idea of being outside of time while being able to influence time as a sort of a linear progression?
Yes, I think so. Particularly if you were talking in reference to, say, the Ark of the Covenant, in the tabernacle in the time of Moses, the holiness of God presiding with the people of Israel. The interesting thing about that is it's the holiness of God. It's to think of it like this. It's not specifically God the Father himself, it's his holiness. It's as if you were to say you have a fire burning, and then the smoke rising up from the fire. If you were to think of God as the fire in that analogy, his holiness is the smoke. Okay, this is what presided with the nation Israel in the time of Moses and with the tabernacle and throughout those generations. Then when we come to Jesus, the incarnation of God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, we find him, the second person of the Trinity, the Son, dwelling in human flesh, the fullness of God in human flesh. It's called the hypostatic union in theology. It's the concept that Jesus was both 100% God. He was as fully divine as he had always been for eternity past, as well as being 100% human, as human being as we are in regard to DNA and body and everything, right? And so, yes, at that particular point we see God the Father and the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, existing outside of time and space, obviously with the influence of the Holy Spirit in the life of Jesus, in the life of those around him, whilst God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, actually dwelling in time and space.
So would you say that any other gods from any other religions sort of fit that bill? So obviously we can focus on Abrahamic religions such as Allah and stuff, but we could also look at Egyptian religions such as Mayat and even to an extent some of the pantheon from the Egyptian context. I mean, obviously not the Greeks because we had a fixed point, but would you say that any of those would be able to fit the idea of a divine mover, if you will?
I think any worldview which has a God that exists outside of time and space in their particular religious system, there's obviously an element of similarity. But I think the question more comes into what is the nature and attributes of God X, whatever happens to be, whether you want to talk about. Because even amongst the so-called great Abrahamic faiths, let's start there with Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. The gods are different.
Yes, that's very true.
And it's a defining mark of Christianity in that no other religion upholds a trinity within its godhead.
Yes.
Allah is in Islamic thought Tawheed. He is one, he's one in essence and being. And so there's no sharing of divinity amongst the Trinity. Same as in the Judaic concept. It's a lot more similar to the Islamic Tawheed in the essence of God than it is to the reality of the Trinity. And so there's vast, whilst you can draw smaller elements of similarity between Yahweh and say the pantheon of Egypt, whether you want to look at Hinduism, it doesn't particularly matter where you go. Wherever there are small similarities, there are absolute chasms of differences.
That's true. That's very true. So given the thousands of other religions, I think this almost pertains to what you just said, but given the thousands of other religions, why is your faith the correct one?
I think the question's almost where to begin. Well, again, if I started in a simple place, such as the fact that, the preponderance of evidence points to the fact that Christianity is true both historically and then sort of more metaphysically, theologically and philosophically. But I don't particularly point to there. What I see as the defining mark as to whether Christianity is true is actually the Bible itself.
Okay.
I see the Bible. I see that that in and of itself, it describes itself as inerrant, being without error.
Yes.
And sufficient, being totally sufficient for Christian life and everything else. And I then see this elaborate and detailed story of how God in the beginning created the universe, worked through Adam and then through down to Noah and then Abraham and all the way through to Moses and the people of Israel, and et cetera, all the way through the works of Christ.
Yep.
And I see a completely unique, how should I say? Well, so I'll use the term worldview. I see a very unique worldview that's found, quite honestly, nowhere in any particular religion.
Okay.
And then what I see is prophecy upon prophecy upon prophecy of things that are said, 700 BC and 500 BC, 1000 BC, 1500 BC, that come into fulfillment through Jesus Christ.
Okay.
You find that nowhere else in any other insert holy text here. You see the private revelations of one particular man in Islam, into the Quran and the Hadiths, as well as even the works of Siddhartha Gautama or the Buddha.
Yes.
You see nothing at all really comparable, especially in nature and in value to that of what we find in the scriptures of Christianity.
Okay.
And so, in a short answer, that's one particular reason why. And again, I need time to
that's
elaborate
fine.
on that. But
that's sufficient enough. With the fact of inerrancy, so obviously there's quite a lot of cases that people point to in the Bible with misconstrued information. So, for instance, Judas dying in. Some argue 3 ways, some argue 2. It comes down to your interpretation of goes to land and buys land. Saul's deaths, obviously. And some of the sort of characters of God, Genesis 6:6, for instance, in which God seems to have a linear progression of time. How can you doubt something if you already know that it's going to happen? How would you sort of explain those, we won't use the word contradictions, but those differences in text with the idea of the Bible being inerrant?
that's a good question. And even if you were to use the term contradiction, because I know that's an often claimed point raised, particularly by many in the neo-atheistic community,
of
that
course.
there are, why would I believe the Bible when it has so many contradictions in it?
Yes.
To be quite frank, every single one of those apparent contradictions or differences or whatever kind of terminology you want to use have been answered many a time sufficiently throughout Christian history. It doesn't take a lot of study to find answers to those particular questions. Even in the case of Judas, did he die from being hung or was he disemboweled? Well, the point is that he died by hanging himself. He then in the heat of the middle of Judea. The rope snaps, he falls on the ground, and his innards burst open. It's one death. There's no contradiction. It's in the case of what we find in Judas, it's the same event with
through
two
different
lenses, with 2 different details explained. And that's how a lot of those kind of elements are, especially when it comes to apparent contradictions or whatnot, or differences in the Gospels, which is an often brought up point. It was to be like if I was to say that. If we witness the crash, you and I, Tim, and you say, this car was driving along the road, it was then T-boned,
Yes.
and that's how the crash happened. Or if I happen to say that well, this guy was driving along the road, a dog ran out on the road, and then they tried to swerve, and then they hit into another car. All right, now that might sound on the surface level like two different stories, but what's happened is I've seen it from one angle, you've seen it from a different angle, or even if we saw it from the same angle.
Yes.
I've described part of it. The driver was driving, they swerved to miss a dog, and they then got T-boned.
Okay.
Right,
Yeah.
we've just described two different elements of the exact same event, and that covers almost the vast majority of apparent differences and contradictions you find anywhere in Scripture. The rest are just either misreadings.
Yes. All right. So we'll just move to sort of the historical aspect of this. Provide one person who met Jesus, wrote about it, and whose existence is confirmed outside the Bible. This means more around the time of Jesus's actual life, as opposed to nowadays, or say a vision or something like that.
Yeah. One example I think off the top of my head is Josephus, the Flavius Josephus, who was the first century Jewish historian. Now, granted, was he alive during the actual time of Jesus? No, but he had first-hand access to eyewitnesses, again, providing another source of people who were in contact with Jesus. He was born in 37 AD, lived through to about 105 AD. And he, in his Antiquities, what's called Josephus' Antiquities, writes about the work and the life and the ministry of Jesus, not in such detail as the four Christian Gospels do, but nonetheless accounts of things that Jesus did, attests to miracles that he did, and again, coming from someone who's not a Christian, who is a Jew, and a Jew of Jews. This is good early testament to what we see written again from early testaments in the Gospels. We see these eyewitnesses attesting to what was done. And again, I know it's a little bit later, but Pliny the Younger, writing at sort of the turn of the first century AD, writing to the then Roman Emperor, describing the works of the Christians and the fact that even under persecution, they would never deny what they had seen with their own eyes, and they would never deny the work that Jesus did. And obviously he goes on to describe people who were Christians who then denied Jesus and paid tribute to Caesar, saying Kaiser Kurios, Caesar is Lord, etc., etc. But he was mainly writing this letter to the emperor to say there are these Christians who it's irrelevant what we try and get them to do, they will not deny Jesus.
Yes.
And so there's two early testaments off the top of my head,
Okay.
that I can probably think of at the moment.
So with that being said, with the idea that the Christians wouldn't give up their beliefs in the face of persecution, could you say that well, we also have the Yellow Turban Rebellion, for instance, in ancient China or ancient Han. They too wouldn't give up their beliefs in the way of persecution. So do you feel that that's sort of, I wouldn't say an equivalency, but do you think that that's a good case to even propose? I mean, people die for many reasons, and simply fighting against persecution isn't exactly an uncommon one. With that also being said, Josephus actually writes about several Yeshuas. He doesn't just write about one.
Yeah, sure.
He does address Christianity, but the rabbi he refers to as Yeshua is often often whether this is
which one he's talking about.
Exactly. So how would you address that?
I think the persecution issue. And again, it's coming from a logical standpoint. And there are elements of, I guess, anthropology, or so not so much anthropology, but sociology involved about the mind of people. But the question I think needs to be asked: is it a reasonable belief, and is it intellectually consistent to say that if you're wanting to say that these events didn't happen, that Jesus Christ did not perform the miracles that are written about him, that he didn't die on the cross for the sins of his people, and that he didn't rise from the dead, then you'd have to explain why, quite literally, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds, and then come the first few centuries,
Yes.
Tens of thousands of people died for something which they would have had to have known was a lie.
Yes.
If you, in regard to Peter or Paul or anyone else in the first century, people who had been around Jesus and had seen him, because the fact that Jesus lived and existed in the time that he reported to is just a historically undeniable fact. It is quite literally a waste of one's own energy and oxygen to try and sit there and debate that Jesus Christ was not a historical figure.
Okay.
You won't find any professor of history worth his weight at any major university in the world that will say, Jesus Christ didn't exist. You'll get the Bart Ehrmans of the world who are, who are what might be called apostates, in like they were Christians, they're now no longer. Even the Bart Ehrmans of the world don't deny that Jesus was a historical figure. The evidence to support that fact is just incomparable in regard to antiquity. But in regard to persecution, the first century Christians would have had to have been dying for something which they would have known was a lie.
Yes.
And there are differences between that and other forms of persecution. If you were to talk about Islamic suicide bombers, because I know that's often a point that's brought up.
It is indeed, yes.
Is that well, there's suicide bombers in different strands of Islam that will kill themselves and all that kind of stuff, and they'll die for their faith. The difference is they're dying for what they hope is a promise. They're dying for what they hope will come, which will be 72 virgins in paradise, and a special place next to the throne of near the throne of Allah. That's completely different to, I witnessed the resurrected Jesus with my own eyes.
Yes.
I walked with him, I saw him, I talked to him. But yet I'm going to die because I know what I have seen. And that's the consistent testimony we see throughout the New Testament, is that it's for what I've seen and what I know, because I was with the resurrected Jesus, and I'm not going to die in vain for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, with that being said, so two sort of responses to that. One is to go back to the Yellow Turban Rebellion again. The same accounts would have been said about, the name escapes me right now, but essentially they followed a guy who was doing miracles and whatnot. They would have said the same thing and professed the same thing, and went to war against Han itself. It's what started the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, etc., etc. Would you say, I mean, because of that, they would essentially be attesting to the same things, and they would see that as a truth? I understand that you said that, it would be them dying for a promise, but could you attest that to Christians? I mean, these people also saw firsthand that their prophet was doing things mystical and magical in nature, and so too had that. So were the Christians also doing this? Were they given a promise? Because although they may have seen that with firsthand, again, in the Yellow Turban Rebellion, they so too saw this. So are those two characters equivalent? I mean, would that mean that Rabbi Yeshua is no greater than... again, the name escapes me.
That's right.
I remember he had a great beard. That's about it.
That's true. Well, I think initially that kind of question rises and falls on what is claimed to have happened with those two men.
Yes.
And I think there's a bit of a category error in comparing the two, in that you've got one case in which a man is reported to have done miracles or magical or mystical
I believe it was healings and something similar to like frenzies and
it wasn't anything prophetic. I know it was
no prophecies. No, it was physical.
And you've got that on one hand, and then you jump over to the case of Jesus, and you've got miracles, you've got healings, you've got walking on water, you've got casting out of demons, and etc. But remember that you've got a public death on a Roman cross for everyone to see.
Yes.
You've got a burial in a very public tomb, and then you've got a very public resurrection from the dead. A bit of a difference in category. in those two examples. And so, I think to compare the two is a bit loaded.
It is indeed.
And so that's probably where I'd sit with that.
No, that's a great answer. I think that's sufficient enough. So, asking this, why doesn't the Bible talk about the universe and life on Earth in terms of scientific reasoning? So, for instance, we have things like Moses struck the rock and water came out of it, and things like this. Obviously, this has not been observed. I mean, there is no rock we can strike. I mean, yes,
true.
there's geysers and whatnot.
No, but in that case,
it's just one example. There are various others. I mean, we have things like the Genesis story in general doesn't seem to align with the forming of the world, or perhaps it does. How do we sort of not come to a compromise, but how do we rectify that? How do we explain this?
I'll address the issue, the example of Moses striking the rock and water coming out.
Yeah,
because that's more pertaining to that kind of question is more pertaining to why do we have in the Bible things that we can't account for in say our geology, that we can't account for in our various disciplines of science. And I think because the beginning premise is that you're trying to answer a question with the wrong tools. The entire point of miraculous events is that they are supernatural. They are beyond the confines and the explainabilities of what we know about our physical universe. To walk on water without being a David Bowie trick with glass under it.
Yes.
It's that we can't explain that by physical process. Striking water out of a rock, can't explain that by physical process. The parting of the Red Sea, you can't explain that by physical process, but you can explain that by the fact that there is an all-powerful God who is the creator of time and space and matter, and therefore has utter control and power to be able to manipulate and change matter however he would so well please. And again, that's the problem, is that when you limit yourself to these various disciplines of science, which is the general tendency of the neo-atheistic community, to say that everything we know about everything falls within the confines of these various scientific disciplines, you cut yourself off from a vast array of knowledge. And that's the problem I find with generally anyone who takes an atheistic position. I'm not going to come out swinging and say it's an arrogant position, but there are elements of arrogance in it. In that, you are claiming to hold the entire preponderance of human knowledge in your head. In that, God can't exist outside of my sphere of knowledge. Because the only way to be able to claim there is no God is to say that I have all knowledge, and I know for a fact that inside all of this knowledge that I have, there is no God. Without taking into account that God, the idea of God and the understanding of God exists outside your realm of understanding at that particular point in time. I'm talking about learning.
Of course.
I'm not talking about intellectual capacity. And so when it comes to that question, coming back to it about lack of scientific explanation in the Bible, it rests on that reason and in the fact that you're trying to answer a particular question with the wrong tools. But it also comes down to the fact that it's not a scientific manual. The Bible is it's a composition of various literary genres: historical narrative, prose, apocalyptic literature, poetry, etc., etc., etc. It's not in any way a scientific development. God is not concerned with telling us exactly scientifically how he brought water out of a rock, as if he would be able to explain that to us.
Yeah,
I don't know. But yeah, I think you're trying to answer a particular question using the wrong tools. You're trying to explain supernatural, extra physical events using purely physical means.
Okay.
Which I think again is a category error.
Would you say, because obviously this feeds into the fallacy of complexity? A lot of atheists would say that it isn't that they feel that they have all the evidence, rather that they haven't been provided with sufficient evidence. So in the same way, you could also argue that the Christian position is arrogant. I mean, without all evidence, how do you just point to God and say, well, God did it? So with that being said, instead of trying to figure out something, or the very reason of why we try to figure out something, why would God design us to question? How do you sort of find a solution to that? I mean, would you say that Christianity is the default position, or would you say that atheism is the default? Which one really has the sort of burden of proof at this point?
Was just the first part.
Yes,
as to whether or not sort of the claim or how much evidence to provide. And this is sort of just straight theology for obvious reasons.
That's fine. Yeah.
I can sit here with one of my atheist friends, of which I have many, and provide evidence after evidence after evidence, a case for this, a case for that, a case for whichever may happen to be. But the problem is that I can never give the atheist enough evidence.
I see.
And again, because the question doesn't come down to somebody needing enough evidence to be able to be convinced. I'm never going to try and convince somebody to become a Christian. I'm going to tell them that that God is a good and holy God, that we have sinned and fallen short of that glory. We have committed crimes against this holy God in our behavior and in our lifestyle, and that we're in trouble with a good God. And then that this same good and yet just God has offered us mercy through the forgiveness of sins, which was achieved by his son on the cross of Calvary 2,000 years ago, and that he commands all people everywhere throughout time to repent of their sins, to do an about turn, and to come to him, to trust in him and to follow him. And he promises to change their heart, to change their thinking, to change their entire life and reorient it back to them, back to himself.
Yes.
And so that's the problem, is that I don't take, and some of our listeners might know this kind of terminology. If not, they'll be able to look it up rather easily.
Yes.
I don't take a evidentialist approach. Someone who might take an evidentialist approach is someone like a William Lane Craig.
Of course.
I take a presuppositional approach.
I see.
So I would say that as far as I see it, my atheist friends know God exists. They know of his character. They don't understand it in its full consummate nature, but they know that God exists, because that's exactly what Romans 1 tells me. Romans 1 tells me that that all people everywhere have the knowledge of God. They simply suppress that truth in unrighteousness, which is kind of the way I was before I became a Christian.
Understood.
I was practicing atheism. I had a verbal profession of faith simply to appease my parents.
Yes.
But practically I was an atheist. I lived life with no regard for God, with rarely a second thought for God, other than when I either found myself in strife or I really wanted something, which for all intents and purposes is neither Christian, and it might as well be atheistic. That was simply a means or a mechanism for me to be able to live my life apart from God, and to morally and intellectually soothe myself and justify myself. And so this is the position I come to, is that I can never give the atheist enough evidence, because the question isn't how much evidence can I give them. I'll simply tell you the good news that has been offered to you by the God that you know exists.
Okay.
And we'll go from there.
So with that being said, do you think that this could also be said for Christians? So when we look at a presuppositional sort of case, obviously it's kind of hard to change a core value. So when we, for instance, provide evidence for the non-existence of God, a Christian doesn't seem to budge and doesn't seem to provide how much evidence, pretty
Yeah,
much you could flip it quite
of course,
easily. Do you think that's sort of not a viable case, but do you think that's sufficient? Do you think that that's a equivalency, basically?
I'll answer that question before I answer that because I didn't get onto the second
Oh,
part
yes,
of that last
yeah.
question. So I think it's fair for me to address that for the listeners.
Definitely.
Which is the default position? Well, again, I think I did almost answer that in the end. In that the default position is. Now I'll use this terminology carefully because I'll need to qualify. But I think the default position is theism.
Okay.
And therefore, for the reasons I explained about the fact that God has made himself known and made himself obvious through that which has been made, and he's made himself known in more detail through the Bible, which is his very words. That being said, I will never simply defend theism, even on the show of the Mind of a Theist.
Yes.
Because I find simple theism or mere theism to be indefensible.
I see.
In that, and this is where I would actually agree with the late Christopher Hitchens, in that to start with theism and to jump to Christianity, you have to cross an absolute chasm the size of the Grand Canyon.
Very true.
And that's why I'll never defend mere theism, because in my eyes, mere theism is indefensible. But I will defend the Christian faith and the existence and the activity of Yahweh till the cows come home, because it is defensible. And so that's the answer to that second half of that question. And then the question we came on to, remind me again what that was.
So when you were saying that we have a presuppositional case, so for instance, we have somebody who you were saying that if you provide so much evidence for an atheist, they won't become a Christian. Do you think it's equivalent to also flip that and say that it seems that Christians won't become an atheist purely because they've provided so much evidence for the case of no gods?
I think if they're pretending to have faith, they will.
I see.
I've seen that 1,001 times in examples such as I was before I became a Christian, where it was merely an intellectual assent to a certain set of premises. And nothing more than that. It's really not that difficult at all to turn someone like that. It happens to most professing Christians, unfortunately, that go to any university within the first year.
Very true.
But with that being said, if you wanted to talk about the evidentialist game, talking about convincing evidences and whatnot, the most that the atheist can point to is naturalistic premises and whatnot, and or just simply, where is God? I don't see God. I don't know anything like that. And the thing I find also when it comes to the atheistic presentation of arguments is that the atheist has to rely on God to even make their arguments.
I see.
Whilst they're making and developing points against the existence of God, electricity is flowing across the synapses in their brain, which was created and upheld by the very God in which they're talking against. As they're developing reasons from biology as to why the Bible is incorrect, they're literally exchanging oxygen for carbon dioxide in their lungs, the ones that God built for them and made for them and continues to uphold, whilst he also upholds their heartbeat and everything else. And the point I'm trying to make is that the only way to make an argument against God is to quite literally steal from the Christian worldview.
Okay.
Not only do you have to fly in the face of all those things I just said, but you also have to point to things which were made by God.
Okay.
To point to biological processes or to point to physical elements of the universe. You're pointing to things created by God, and it's the irony of the atheistic argument. Now again, I understand that you don't believe that. But nonetheless.
But no, that's I mean, we could address that, but I think it does go into a presuppositional case. If we assume that God exists and created all things, then yeah. So we'll move on to a little bit more of historicity. If you compare the stories of Noah with one of my favorite books, the Babylonian Tale, Ziusudra in the story is almost identical to Noah's tale. The only real difference seems to be the gods in question, obviously, and the fact that I guess he had an extra bird, a raven.
A raven.
And we also have others that could be said are the same. Enkidu, and again, the Babylonian verse is quite similar to Adam. I actually wouldn't say identical. It's a bit of a stretch.
That's a big stretch.
We also have things like chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead, which has several things that are quite similar to the Ten Commandments. How would you sort of address these? I mean, how would you address these similar narratives that seem to pop up within history that often predate Abrahamic sort of religions?
It's a good question. I think I just addressed it in two parts. The first being that I think when it comes to the comparison of ancient pagan beliefs to Christianity, and by extension, the Old Testament, encompassing that, I'm trying to say Israel.
Yes.
I think that there is a bit too often a very long bow that's drawn in the comparisons. I mean, even if you were to talk about Ziusudra, again, an ark, yes, but in that case, it rained for 7 days.
Yes.
In the Genesis account, it's 40 days and 40 nights. So automatically, you've got a difference from the very get-go. Even in the cases of which are commonly drawn between the resurrection of Jesus and the quote-unquote resurrection of Osiris. That's another case in which you've got two things which really are not that similar.
Yes.
Osiris, it's chopped into 13 pieces. Isis then recovers 12 of them, and he's spiritually resurrected in the underworld.
Yes, exactly.
Which is just an unbelievable category to try and compare that to Jesus physically dying, being buried in a tomb, and on the third day physically rising from the dead.
Yeah.
And so, the comparisons are very unfair in many instances. But with that being said, in regard to particularly the flood example, I think if there was a global cataclysmic flood, I would expect, generally, to find localized retellings and localized accounts of that event. I think the fact that there are flood accounts or flood stories or flood myths or whatever kind of word you want to use around the world, quite literally, everything from the Far East to Mesopotamia to South America.
Yes.
Is actually evidence to support the fact that there was a global flood. Now, yes, you've got a retelling because that fits the pagan cultures that they find themselves in. Whether it be the Gilgamesh epic, you're of course going to find the fact that it's the gods.
Yes.
And it's a sacrifice on the altar to the gods.
Yes.
And all this kind of thing. But they are pagan retellings of an event that actually occurred. And that's the kind of thing that you would generally expect from such a cataclysmic global event such as a worldwide flood. And so that I think actually supports and bolsters the Christian position.
Yeah. So with that being said, as you said, it would be a retelling from a paganistic sort of view. Could that also be said of the Jews? I mean, well, if there was a cataclysmic event, aren't they able also to just slap the name of their god onto it and change some of the language and words to fit their narrative?
Well, on one element, I guess you could say yes, but again, that comes back to the question of the inerrancy of the Bible.
Yes.
It comes back to the question of the reality of the Bible in the face of every single other pagan writing in antiquity.
Okay.
And that's where the position sort of either rises or falls.
No, I think that's a sufficient answer. So we'll move on to a more theological aspect. What is your response to the problem of evil? A favorite of the neo-atheistic community.
Many Christian peers of mine would actually say that the question of evil is the best card of the neo-atheist or of the atheist. which I would disagree with.
Okay.
See, I think the fact that the question is phrased the way it is, if there is a God, why is there so much evil? Again, stealing from the Christian worldview. You are saying that there is evil. By using the word evil, you're making a truth claim to an objective morality or ethic of what is right and what is wrong. Which from your own worldview you can't do. Okay, if we are simply molecules in motion having evolved over time upon the forces of random chance from a primordial setting through to what we are now, there is no way you can possibly claim that there is an objective right and wrong or a good and an evil. You can't do that. Evolution does not account for, an atheistic worldview without a God does not account for any morality. It's just simply survival of the fittest. It's preferences.
Yes.
It's okay. You might not like genocide and murder, but I do.
Okay.
And so the question of evil, when it comes to this in response of evil, is that firstly, to even claim that there is evil, you're again borrowing from the Christian worldview. When I account then from the Christian perspective as to the question of evil, the problem with evil, in as concise a manner as I could do it. There is evil, and because I agree that there is evil. We actually agree on that. I'm just simply pointing out the faulty premise from the atheistic perspective to start.
Yes, of course.
But with the question of evil, evil has arisen in the world, which is again an argument I'm sure many of our listeners have heard, from Adam and from the first sin that he committed, and from the fall. Him disobeying God and eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. No, we don't know whether it was an apple or not.
Yes, yeah.
And I think it's irrelevant. But nonetheless, disobeying God and eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And therefore, after that, actually having the knowledge of good and evil. That's why it was called that. And from that sin, all of creation was corrupted. Humanity now had a sinful nature. We were now pervaded and corrupted by sin and death. And that's gone throughout the world, and that's the case for every single person born of woman. And that's where our evil comes from. We have in our natural state, the human condition is one of sinfulness. And this is again coming back to the gospel. This is why the gospel is euangelion in the Greek. It is the good news. Okay. Because the good news is that despite our depravity, despite the fact that we are totally and utterly corrupted by sin, and we love our sin and we love living apart from God, and rebelling against Him either through indifference or antagonism. The good news is that in our plight, the very God whom we've rebelled against is offering us mercy and forgiveness and the opportunity to be restored into a right relationship with Him and treated that way.
So just two things there. One of the answers to the sort of objective morality, and I will say one of the, because whenever I've said this, they're like, well, how do you define this? And it's like, it's one aspect. Anyway, they would say that from an evolutionary and societal sort of standpoint, when we view morality, it is what is for the betterment of society or the person in question.
So definitely for that.
So for instance, a lot of Christians and a lot of apologists will say something like, well, what's wrong with murder? Well, what's wrong with murder is that it's a detriment to a person's safety and to their livelihood. Now, does that mean that's good or evil? Well, those are general terms. I mean, what are you really looking at specific of that person's life? So would that person, for instance, enjoy being murdered? No. So don't do that. And that's why we have things like prisons and things like that to keep those in check so society can still function and society still functions so that people can have a livelihood. Now, that's just one reply. I think that's sort of just something that I'm sure there's at least one person listening to. And
I could respond to that.
Yeah, no, go for it. Go for it.
I think it's again, it's a common point. I've had to address it many times. even if we took the example of murder, which was, so we're bypassing theft, we're bypassing lying, we're going straight.
We're going straight to murder.
Straight to murder
It's the
because-
fallacy of Hitler. Just go
that's-
straight to the Holocaust.
Why not? Even if we come to murder, my position works on all arguments. So
Yes.
come to the question of murder from the atheist perspective. Well, why would you murder? Well, because it causes the other person to suffer. Plus, it's not good for human flourishing. Is generally a viewpoint I hear a lot.
Of course.
Well, again, if I'm rebutting that, what is good about human flourishing? Who says that human flourishing is morally good? Who says that your well-being is morally good? And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that, again, I'm playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, of
but
course.
nonetheless, the point is that above and beyond your own preferences, you cannot make a claim and be intellectually consistent and objective in saying that this is a moral evil or a moral bad. What Hitler did in Nazi Germany during World War II was morally wrong. That was simply, from as far as you can logically go, that was simply Hitler's preferences over and above the Allies. And might I add, this was actually the point that was brought up during the Nuremberg trials.
Yes, indeed.
Justice Jackson, the Justice for the United States of America,
Yes. Almost verbatim, actually. Yes.
came against the nearly 70 Nazi lawyers who were, in their own credit, very, very bright and very, very good at what they did.
Indeed.
And one of their defining points was pointing to the Allies and saying, who in God's name are you to come into our land, to come into our culture and tell us how we should operate?
Yes.
Tell us what is right and wrong. They pointed straight to subjective morality. And for a number of weeks, nearly a number of months, the trials were put on a bit of a hiatus.
Yes, they were.
Whilst the Allies tried to reconcile this. And like I said, Justice Jackson of the United States of America came along and said, no.
And
There is an objective morality, all right? And by God, what you have done is wrong. It is wrong for all places and for all times and for all people to murder and to pillage and to do everything that Nazi Germany did.
Okay.
And that's what, and that's an element. I don't say the divine, but that's an
No, of
element
course,
of what led to an Allied victory at the Nuremberg trials.
Indeed.
And so the point I'm trying to make is that the most you can point to is just merely preferences. Because again, and this is a point that even Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, came to. He came to the point a bit more nihilistic than maybe some of our listeners are.
I think that's his calling cards.
Yeah. But nonetheless, his point was a logical one. I'll give Nietzsche this. He followed the logic.
Indeed.
And the logic took him to the place of, the only question I have left to answer is, why not commit suicide now?
Yes.
What is the point? What is the point? What is good about my own life and good about my own flourishing other than my own simple preferences? Because evolutionarily, he can't justify that.
Yeah, exactly.
And stay intellectually consistent. And so the point I'm trying to make is that yeah, there is no consistency in saying this is a moral evil or this is wrong above and beyond your own preferences. And that's my point, is that, see, you know something's wrong. We know that murder's wrong. Again, that's the other argument that's brought up. If you need if you need a Bible to tell you that murder's wrong, that rape's wrong, and all these other living things, then you know, what kind of human being are you? And the point is, well, you don't actually necessarily need a Bible to do it, because you have a conscience that has been placed in you by God, and you know what's right and wrong, because that's exactly what God said he did. All right? You know what is good and bad. You know that it's wrong to lie, because when you come to it and you're about to lie, there's that moment of pause where you go, should I really do this? Now people go and do it anyway, and again, I'm no stranger to lying.
Yes.
But this is the common human experience,
Of course.
because this is how it is. We have a conscience that is God-given, that he gave to us in really his own grace for what's good for us, to know what's right and wrong. Now again, we choose to go against that, and that's the natural disposition of man.
Of course.
But nonetheless, that question sits there on its own.
No, that's a great answer. So given God's behavior as described in the Bible, what reason is there to worship him? Now, this is obviously goes into something of subjective morality almost again. But for somebody who's reading cases for things like the genocide of people and owning of slavery and things like that, would you say that is is that a good thing? I mean, is this something that you can support almost? Now that's obviously loaded language. I mean, can you support this, rather, how do you sort of how would you explain worshipping a God that would do those things?
Rather easily, I think, actually. I think that's an easier question than I thought it was going to be.
Oh, wonderful.
Again, it doesn't particularly matter which example you'd like to point to, whether it be how can you worship the God who destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yes.
How can you worship the God who commanded Israel to go into Canaan and to wipe out anything that lived or breathed? Which they didn't do a very good job at.
No.
That's a different story. How can you worship a God who commanded a man to literally sacrifice his own son on an altar?
Yes.
Again, it doesn't particularly matter which event you point to, or then the typical Dawkins argument of the tyrannical monstrosity that murders his own son in such a gruesome fashion.
Yes.
Right. Rather simply, to even say that what was conducted there was morally wrong on the part of God, is to assume yourself to the throne of God, to kick him off and to sit on it, and for yourself to declare what is morally right and wrong. Make no mistake, there is no evil in God. He is neither the author of it nor the conductor of it. Let's go through a few of those examples that I mentioned.
Yeah, sure.
The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, a pagan nation which lived in rebellion against God, which had existed for a considerable amount of time before
Indeed.
what happened to it, which God had patience with and forbearance with, and he put up with the immoral and evil behaviors of the peoples of Sodom and Gomorrah in their tyranny and in their forced enslavement and torture of people, which we see through antiquity. It's a fairly widely accepted historical fact.
Yes.
God put up with that. But God has every right to say enough is enough, and to put an end to the evil that was committed in Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes.
Moving on to the next example of Israel being commanded to wipe out the peoples of Canaan. Again, another evil pagan culture. I'm not saying evil because it was pagan, I'm saying evil because of their actions.
I see.
Canaan was a culture and a society which would take their newborn children, put them inside the altar and the statue to Molech, a big iron brass bull, put the child in that and then set the thing on fire.
Yes. Yeah.
They are the archetype of child sacrifice, all right, and a moral monstrosity.
Yes.
Okay. For God to command Israel to bring justice against these people is not a moral evil. Again, if you don't understand what God was doing there, that's where you fall into the faulty view of saying this is a moral evil. Besides the issues of saying God is morally evil, because of having to assume oneself to the throne of morality, or the throne of judge, I should say, as to what is moral. And again, it doesn't matter particularly which example you take. These are all just acts. Okay, these were God bringing justice, having put up with it for quite literally centuries, which he didn't have to do. God in his good judgment has decided that the punishment for sin is death.
Okay.
Okay. To commit sin against an infinitely holy God is a crime that most of us cannot imagine the depth of and the gravity of. Because it's an offense to his very character and his good nature. Okay. And so for him to even put up with the evils and the monstrosities of these cultures that existed for centuries and thousands of years in the sight of God, it was an act of His grace and mercy. And so for him then to bring justice against these cities or against these societies is just that. It's justice, because
Okay.
he is the determiner of justice.
So, with that being said, what would your answer be to why they were created in the first place? Now, if God is Omnimax, He knows what's going to happen, and so He created those people quite literally to suffer. Why would He do that, essentially? I mean, obviously, that's a big question. You'll have to, but
Yeah, of course. No, I'll try and make it concise, because it's a question as to it's really a question as to the will, the sovereignty and the will of God, and the foreordination of God, which are real things. Finding the best place to start. I'll start here.
Yes.
The responsibility of good and evil, in other words, where the responsibility lies in regard to justice being brought against someone for their good and evil actions, lies solely within themselves.
Yes.
So I am solely responsible for my moral decisions.
Okay.
As is every single human being. Okay, we've been given a conscience by God. Even in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, they had no Bible, they had no Old Testament text, nothing like that. But they had their conscience, and they had, which was put there by God to determine good and evil. That is what He said, and that's why we know. I agree with the atheists when they say,
yes,
if you need do you really need a Bible to tell you what's good and evil? Well, no, you don't actually. The Bible only confirms what your conscience already knows.
Okay.
And so to draw that point to a close, people are solely responsible for their decisions. They are solely responsible for irrelevant of trivial life decisions. They are responsible for their decisions of good and evil, their moral decisions, their decisions to either do good or to do evil. And then on top of that, the question of, if God already knew that they would do that, why create it in the first place?
Exactly.
Well, that kind of question is, if I can be frank, is neither here nor there, because that would be to assume that, oh well, if they're going to commit evil, don't create them. Okay, well, if that was the logic, then God would need to create no one.
Yes.
In and of myself, without the grace of God, I am no more justifiable than anyone who lived in Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm no more justifiable than any of the people of Canaan. Now, do I sacrifice my children on the altar to Molech? Well, no. And is my degree of sin and the types of sin I commit as egregious as that? Well, no. But my sin is no more justifiable in the eyes of God than what they committed. That's what I mean by that.
I see.
And so morally, I'm on a level playing field with them in regards to my stance before God.
Okay.
And so to simply say, well, if God knew that they would do that, why create them anyway? Well, I lie in the same camp.
Okay.
And so do you, and so does every single other person who has ever existed in regard to whether we are good with God or not good with God.
Yes.
And then the question comes, I guess, as a flow from that, as to why would He allow them to continue to exist? Well, to serve His good pleasure.
Okay.
To serve His purposes and His will in the world. God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, to bring justice, but also to show His justice and to show His wrath against evil. And that served God's purpose to demonstrate His character and nature, in that He is a just God who will bring justice against the wicked. And so if that serves God's purpose, He has every right to do that. We see that in the case of Pharaoh and Moses.
We do indeed.
At the beginning, before Moses even went back to Egypt, having spent time out working and tending to sheep, God says to him, I'll harden Pharaoh's heart and I'll use him for my purposes. If God's power and sovereignty is demonstrated through his forbearing and using of people who have turned against him, then that's not in any sense a moral evil. That is completely justifiable.
Okay.
For God to use Pharaoh to demonstrate his power, i.e. to demonstrate his power when he brought the people of Israel out from underneath Egyptian slavery across the Red Sea and into the wilderness, and then following by extension then through to Canaan,
Sure.
we talked about earlier. If that serves his purposes to demonstrate his attributes and his power and his glory, then he has every right to do that.
So when we examine that, why in that instance would God give humans the inherent evil and then punish them for that? I mean, if it's merely ego-stroking purposes to show how powerful he is that any sort of existence that you can give to somebody? I mean, is that sufficient enough for, say, an atheist who's thinking about coming to faith to be told, well, you were created for his pleasure? Do you think that's, I wouldn't say convincing, but do you think that that's, well, frankly, fair to say, to create somebody who can think and rationalize things, to somebody who can comprehend these things and then strip it away from them? To have these feelings and then punish them for that, to be aware of what they're going to do and still give them the choice, but be aware of those decisions and then punish them for it. Do you think that that's a fair case? I mean, obviously, again, that puts the person onto the sort of equivalent of God, but would you say that that would be a sufficient case? I mean, or even a worthy life?
I think one initial issue I had with that question was almost the very first part of it. God giving someone an evil nature. If the listeners remember earlier, I said that God is not the author of evil.
Yes.
Which he's not. God did not create evil, nor was he the arbiter of evil. And so in that, that's the first issue that needs to be cleared out of the way.
Okay, well...
But here I can continue to answer that question.
No, that's fine.
Without that, I just need to qualify that.
To qualify that, let's
go with that. Yeah.
Who then is the author of evil?
We are.
Okay, but again, why allow us to do that if you have all power? Why allow us to be the authors of evil?
I'm thinking where to start. Here's a point. Many Christian apologists would probably generally answer that question by saying, because if God wants us to have a loving relationship with us, he needs to give us free will, and therefore, when it comes with free will, there's always going to be the opportunity to sin, which I disagree with. I think the point of free will is generally overinflated in many Christian apologetic examples.
I see.
But nonetheless, this is what I would say. Because did God know the fall was going to happen? Absolutely. Did he plan for it? Yes, he absolutely did. If the fall did not happen, and this is going to be a point that maybe our listeners haven't heard before, I will go on to explain it, and it might lead to follow-up questions. But
That's fine. I'm just devil's advocate here.
No, these are great questions, and our listeners are putting good questions. Did God know the fall was going to happen? Yes. Did he plan for it? Yes. And so when I say plan for it, that means that if he didn't plan for it, the fall wouldn't have happened, right? So that means that yes, God did plan the fall. Did he execute it? Did he do it? No, he didn't. Adam did. Through the influence of the serpent or Satan or whatnot. And yes, so God did plan for humanity to fall into a state of sinfulness and to fall into a state of separation for him. Now, why do I say he planned for that? I say he planned that so that he could then send his son as the savior of the world, to take upon himself the wrath of God on behalf of his people, and to then rise from the dead 3 days later, and to bring to himself glory for saving fallen creatures, for saving all those who would come to him and repent of their sins and believe in the Son. All right? Because that's the way, in his good decision and in his good will, he is determined that that is the way for him to get the glory he wants, which he has the right to. And that's something that our listeners need to understand, is that God has the right to get the glory he deserves.
I see.
And to get the glory that he wants, because again, he's God. And when we say, it doesn't matter whether we're a Christian or a non-Christian, okay, when we say that God shouldn't have done that, we're assuming ourselves to the throne of God and kicking him off of it, and you just can't do that. Can't do that. There's no way to justify that. And that even comes back to the point of what we just earlier about God using,
yes, of course.
God using a wicked Pharaoh for his own purposes to bring out the people of Israel and set us home. That is the way that God has determined himself to get the most glory.
I see.
And so again, acknowledging the fact that God doesn't give us a sinful nature. We have a sinful nature because we've inherited it from Adam. Okay. That's the way I'd address that kind of question. Okay. In as short a way as we can possibly.
Yes, of course. There's a whole library up the hill there that I'm sure has others.
Yeah, and that's the constraint. And again, I could deliberate on that point for quite literally hours.
Of course,
if we had the time.
So because actually, since we're reaching our hour mark, I'm just going to give the question. I did promise I would ask.
Go for it.
Everybody, can God make a burrito so hot that even he himself cannot eat it?
Okay, so this kind of gets into the questions of can God create a rock too large for himself to lift?
Yes, the burrito is just much better.
The burrito, I've never heard the burrito one, so that's listener, if you put that one in, that's a new one for me. So that's pretty funny. This comes into this is where we drift into the realm of logical fallacy. I could answer this question in regard to being within the universe. See, if this was a simple question of God in the universe, it would be a really simple one to answer.
Of course.
Because it'd be like the question of an immovable. If there's, what happens when an immovable force meets an unstoppable force meets an immovable object?
Yes.
The question is that it can't happen because both those things can't exist in the same universe at the same time.
Yes.
If there's an unstoppable force, then that means by definition that there is no such thing as an immovable object.
Yeah, it's a paradox.
It's a paradox. But again, the concept of can God create, what was the wording of it? A burrito too hot for himself to eat. That's a good one. Create a burrito too hot for himself to eat. Well, again, the answer is no, because you're coming into a paradox of trying to dispel the omnipotence of God.
Yes.
Without understanding, the nature of paradox, and without understanding that that's just not how things work. It's like, can God create a square circle? Well, no, because by definition a square is a square.
Yes.
And by definition a circle is a circle. There's no such thing as a square.
Yeah.
It's like me saying, oh, I'm a married bachelor.
Yeah, exactly.
Or you're not, by definition. And that's not the question of omnipotence. The question of omnipotence is God having the power to do whatever he wills. That is what the question of omnipotence is. Can God create a square? Of course. Can he create a circle? Yes. But he can't create a square circle because the thing doesn't exist.
Yes,
by definition, contradictory. Can he create a burrito too hot for himself to eat? Well, no, because that then goes beyond the logical paradoxes of the definition. Exactly. And so that's the question that needs to be understood, is to the omnipotence of God. It's in regard to, does God have the ability and the power and the sovereignty to do whatever he wills? And the answer is absolutely yes.
No, that's a terrific answer for that. Again, this is one of those questions that is much bigger than sort of first glance. Thanks again for letting me interview you. This has been a really I think this has been a really powerful one, and I'm sure the listeners may agree with that. So at the end of these things, I usually just let somebody plug something or recommend a book or something like that. So is there anything you want to...
scrolling through the my home library, which is far too big for someone my age. I think something that would be most helpful for the listeners to watch it is, and this is more of a radio and television broadcast. It's not, when I say television, you would be able to access it on YouTube.
Yeah.
Is an American program called Wretched, spelled the way like WRE, Wretched. You could find their YouTube channel. Literally, just Wretched is the YouTube channel, hosted by a gentleman called Todd Friel. Todd, Todd, Friel, Friel, I believe. They deal with many sort of socio-political hot topics, things of that kind of nature. But also, what they do is they're providing an apologetic from the Christian perspective, on many issues. And if you were to access their website, I believe it's Wretched. So the wretchedradio.com or wretched.tv. They have multiple sites. You'll find various different material you can either download or buy or watch for free, which provides a good Christian apologetic for many of these kind of things, the kind of topics the listeners are interested in, the kind of topics we've discussed here today, Tim. And so that off the top of my head, that would be a resource that I would strongly recommend.
Sure.
Because you're going to find a Christian perspective, right, that is not watered down, not compromised in any way. So you're going to get Christian truth, but you're going to get Christian truth in a very civilized and loving fashion. Will it be confronting to your worldview? Well, yes, of course. That's the nature of these kind of discussions.
Sure.
But it's not going to be an ad hominem assault on your existence as a human being.
I see.
Okay. So I definitely recommend that the viewers and the listeners check out Wretched on YouTube, Wretched Radio or Wretched.tv online, hosted by Todd Friel. It's a very good resource for gaining and understanding the Christian perspective.
Sure. And I'm just going to plug this is actually for, I usually give an atheistic thing, but this is again for my theistic listeners. At the current college we're at, I'm sure most people have caught on that it's Moreland College. I'm going to be running an almost inverse Bible study. What this means is we'll be going through the works of Dawkins, Hitchens and stuff as theistic sort of approach to them. So essentially, perhaps one night we'll be reading through the God Delusion together or something like that. I'm still working on the name. I'm thinking either Don't Panic, after one of my favorite novels of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or another suggestion was Defense Against the Dark Arts, which I quite liked as well.
Our listeners should like that.
Yes, there's some. It's sort of in the process right now, but once it's all together, I'll be plugging that at the end of these interviews. But anyway, thanks again for interviewing. Thanks for taking an hour out of your day to sit down and listen to some our atheism sort of stuff.
No problem at all.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, mate. All right, and thanks for listening to The Mind of a Theist, episode 5.